Hey guys, I'm Heidi Prieb. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. Today on this channel, I want to talk about the term inner child. So if you've watched at least a couple of my videos, there's a very high chance that you've already heard me use this term, but I've never made a whole video where I just break down what I mean when I say inner child, as well as how I personally like to work with the concept of an inner child and how I apply it to my own healing work, shadow work, whatever it is that I'm trying to access internally. So the term inner child means a lot of different things depending at what modality or what field you're looking at. Internal family systems has one definition of an inner child. Transactional analysis has another definition. I personally first came across the term when I was reading John Bradshaw books. So he has a book called Homecoming that is all about using visualization techniques to help you integrate your inner child. But the way that I use this term is not necessarily identical to any of those modalities. What a lot of those different modalities look at as the inner child is the parts of ourselves that have become arrested in their development. So parts of ourselves that didn't kind of grow up chronologically at the same speed that the rest of us did because some form of trauma or early wounding kept parts of ourselves stuck in our emotional or intellectual development. So a lot of the time when you hear people in the psychology space talking about an inner child, that's what they're referencing. The parts of ourselves that are kind of young and naive relative to the rest of us, or the parts of ourselves that are stuck around some form of trauma. Now, all of those are great ways to use the term inner child, but I found that for myself, there was another way I found to use this term that became very helpful, particularly when doing shadow work. So I like to use the idea of an inner child. The idea of a kind of younger version that lives inside of me as a way to bypass the parts of my brain that try to explain away my feelings. So for myself, and I imagine this is definitely not unique to me, there are a lot of parts of my brain that try to kind of reason away the idea that I might be feeling something. So I'll have, let's say, a bit of anger come online, and some part of my brain will go, oh no, you must not feel angry about that, because I can understand why that's happening. And if I can understand it, it must mean that I'm not actually angry. And then my body's feeling one thing, but my mind is telling me another thing. So now I have internal incongruence, and I have to do something kind of weird with that anger in order to get it to go away from my conscious awareness. But chances are, I never actually process it, and so it shows up at another point in time, and it maybe causes more trouble when it does show up, because now it's one step removed from the actual situation it originated from. Another way we can deny or distort our emotional experience is refusing to acknowledge when we are hurt or in pain. And this is often something, particularly if you're on the avoidant side of the attachment spectrum, that your brain might do without even consciously consulting you. So someone might do something that hurts your feelings, and consciously, your brain is automatically going to come online and go, that doesn't hurt my feelings. I just think that this person is emotionally immature, they can't control their own emotions, this has nothing to do with me, ergo, my feelings are not hurt. So the way that I like to think about an inner child is I like to visually represent this kind of kid who lives inside of me, who still feels hurt and pain and anger and all of these very raw emotions, even in the situations where my adult brain thinks that it knows better. So picturing a little child living inside of me allows myself to give myself permission to feel things that my cognitive brain would otherwise try to rationalize away. So to recap, I think of the inner child as the part of the self that is emotional, vulnerable, and not particularly responsive to reason. The inner child is going to feel whatever they're going to feel, no matter how hard you try to convince them that they don't need to feel that. And the inner child is also the birthplace of our creativity. So the parts of ourselves that feel really enthusiastic and energetic and curious and open-minded about being alive are all qualities that are generally a sign of a healthy inner child, which once again just means an integrated person who allows the full spectrum of their emotions to exist. Now, the last quality of the inner child that I'm going to talk about in the introduction here is that they are vulnerable and in need of protection. So inner children are very trusting, they're very impressionable, and some part of them is kind of taking everything in as true, even if our adult brains are telling them that something is false. So if someone says something really mean or unkind to me, in my adult mind, I might go, I know that thing's not true. But it's still going to reach and hurt my inner child, even if I know rationally that that is not the case. So when we start thinking about inner children, we also need to start thinking about how to protect those parts of ourselves, as well as how to push them towards growth, and both are important in different scenarios. So if our inner children are the kind of raw, impulsive, emotional parts of ourselves, we also all have an inner parent. So an inner parent is the part of myself I like to think of as being responsible for protecting my inner child. Whereas the inner child wants to run and explore and find out all of the time, the inner parent is the part of myself that knows about what's important and needs to be prioritized, even if it's not fun, in order to keep myself safe and emotionally secure long term. So the inner parent is this practical, disciplined, and future-oriented part of ourselves that knows how to do things like delay gratification, set meaningful goals, and discern when it's time to indulge in an inner child's emotion versus when it's time to push them a little bit. So our inner parent is the part of ourselves that is very focused on self-preservation, so making sure that we stay safe and stable in the world. And most people tend to err on one side or the other when it comes to which part of their internal experience they listen to more. Sometimes people will have their inner child running the entire show. So you'll have this kind of emotional, impulsive version of yourself making all of the decisions with very little foresight about how that's going to play out down the line. And if that's the case, it's likely that the development work you need to do is actually more around your inner parent than your inner child. Maybe you have some wounding around the idea that a parent could be nurturing and caring as well as disciplined. And so you're trying to just run away from the entire parenting process, not realizing that there's a way to be loving and healthy in that parenting process. And on the other side of things, we have people who do a lot of inner parenting, but they kind of stifle the inner child in the process. So not giving enough value to things like joy and excitement and curiosity and creativity, and instead doubling down on only what makes practical sense, which can often lead to feeling kind of depressed and dead inside. Depression, burnout, anxiety are very frequently signs of a neglected inner child. So again, for some of us, the qualities that are more inherent to that inner child are what we find in our shadow. If growing up it was not adaptive for us to be explorative and emotional and creative and playful, those might be the parts of ourselves that we now need to learn to allow ourselves access to. Or if when we were growing up it was actually very adaptive for us to be vulnerable to a fault and to not develop the skills of discipline or self-regulation, those are going to be the traits that you find in your shadow and that you need to start making conscious for yourself in order to step into a more adult role in your life. So with that kind of introduction, and once again, this is mostly just how I look at the term inner child and inner parent. It is not the way to look at it, and there are a lot of different people who look at it slightly differently. I'm going to go over 5 ways that I like to work with my own inner child, inner parent dynamic in order to help me kind of bypass the critical filters that normally shield me from seeing what's in my shadow and make that shadow content more conscious so that I can start to integrate it. So the first way I recommend working with your inner child is to improve your relationship with self-protection. The question that I like to frequently ask myself in the presence of other people is if I had a literal 5-year-old child. So 5-year-old is pretty emotional, pretty vulnerable, and pretty susceptible to believing whatever they're told. Would I feel comfortable leaving my 5-year-old child in the temporary care of this person? And this person could be a new romantic interest, it could be a friend, it could be a family member. But this question, would I be comfortable handing over a 5-year-old to this person and trusting that they're going to be able to take reasonably good care of them and that they're not going to abuse them in any significant way or make them feel unnecessarily bad about themselves? I use that as a barometer for whether or not it's safe for me to be vulnerable with a given person. Because there is a part of me, whether I like it or not, that is 5 years old, and that will feel hurt if I'm insulted, or will feel confused and distressed if I'm vulnerable in the presence of someone who's completely non-regulated themselves. And so what this doesn't mean is that if the answer is no, I wouldn't leave a 5-year-old child alone with this person, we have to cut them out of our lives entirely. What it means is that that might just not be the right person or the right time for us to let our guards down around somebody. When we are vulnerable, when we are allowing ourselves to be kind of raw and messy in front of another person, it is like we are letting the 5-year-old inside of us directly interact with another person. So we need to be reasonably sure that that other person is able to do things like handle delicate topics with maturity and respect to us when they come up. So if I'm ever in a situation where someone is speaking to me in a way that is very rude or disrespectful, what I try to ask myself is, would I be comfortable with someone speaking to my 5-year-old child this way? And if the answer is no, what would I say to that person to let them know it's not okay to speak to my child that way? Because if I had a literal child, I would see it as very important to stand up for them and for them to know that I care about them and I'm not going to let other people speak rudely to them. So if there's ever a situation where someone is speaking to me in a disrespectful or rude way, and I think, ooh, I would not let them speak to my child that way, I know that I now have the responsibility as my inner parent to stand up for myself towards that person. Or else I'm going to lose the respect of my inner child and I'm going to lose my own self-trust. I need to prove to myself that I matter and that I deserve respect the same way I would want to prove that to a 5-year-old child. And so this is kind of the first area I like to look at when I'm thinking about doing inner child work. If I have trouble accessing and giving credit to my own vulnerability, I try to think of the part of myself that is small and vulnerable and impressionable as a literal child that I am responsible for protecting. And it gets a lot easier to figure out what type of boundaries I need to have in place when I can think of myself in that way. The second place that the inner child, inner parent dynamic comes in really handy is when we're examining our relationship with growth and self-development. So again, most of us fall a little bit more on one side of the spectrum. We either tend to let our feelings and our inner child run too much of the show, or we push ourselves too hard and don't listen to our feelings of pain and burnout when they come up. And so this can be another helpful question to ask the self. If, let's say, I'm up against a challenge, I'm facing something at work or interpersonally, and the adult part of my brain feels like I should just power through, but I'm starting to feel really depressed, burnt out, whatever it is, I can ask myself the question, if I had a child in this situation, and I were trying to teach the child how to be a healthy, productive person in the world, in this situation, would I push them to try a little bit harder and give it another go? Or would I look at that kid and go, they are absolutely exhausted and I think they need some time to rest before we get back at this? And sometimes just thinking about it in that kind of externalized way can help us get a clear picture of where we're at. There are absolutely in life times when we need to push ourselves to grow past our comfort zones. There are very important types of struggle and challenge and pain that we all need to be able to coach ourselves through in order to get to the places we want to get to in life. But there's also a point where pushing ourselves hits a kind of point of diminishing returns, where our inner children are going to start throwing tantrums, they're going to start doing bad work, they're going to zap our ability to be creative, and so we need to be looking at what the right balance is. If you err on the side of ignoring your feelings when you start to get uncomfortable or distressed, doing this kind of visualization can help you recognize that actually tending to that inner child, giving them rest, giving them comfort, giving them support, giving them either alone time or time with others if that's what they need, is ironically going to be the thing that makes you more productive in the long run. Because inner children have boundless energy when we treat them right. They're able to accomplish a lot more than adults are able to accomplish in a shorter period of time. So when we can recognize those moments when they're getting burnt out and give them what they need to feel replenished again, we're ironically making ourselves more productive and successful in the long run. And on the other side of things, you might have a sense in your life of having just given up. Like you don't care, you don't want to try for things, everything feels pointless. And when we're lacking a deep sense of self-love, it can be easy to just feel perpetually like we don't care if we fail. But a lot of us would care if our children failed, if they never developed the skills that they needed to persevere and get what they wanted out of life. And so thinking of ourselves in that way, once again, as a child that we are responsible for raising with the values of kindness and empathy and self-compassion, but also the values of discipline and self-esteem, suddenly pushing ourselves starts to feel like a greater act of self-love. Good parents know when it's not time to give in to their inner child, and they know when it's time to support and encourage them to tackle a challenge rather than giving up on it prematurely. The third way I recommend working with the inner child, inner parent dynamic is to address your relationship with your body. So a question that I found it increasingly useful to ask myself in my adult life is, if I had a child who I fed, groomed, and dressed the way that I feed, groom, and dress myself, what message would I be sending to that child about their importance and self-respect? So if I'm neglecting my body, that child might feel frumpy and unimportant. But on the flip side, if I'm over-fixated on appearance, my inner child might be learning that nothing about me matters but my looks. And of course, like most things, there is a happy medium right in the middle, where we treat our bodies with respect, but also leniency. And when we're able to strike that happy medium, we're telling our inner children that they deserve to feel nourished and valuable, and that they deserve to take a certain degree of pride in the way that they present themselves to the world. And why shouldn't they? There's absolutely nothing noble about having a terrible self-image. No matter what our body looks like, no matter how much of a symmetrical face we were or were not born with, all of us have the opportunity to treat our bodies with care and respect, to give them healthy, nourishing foods, to dress ourselves in a way that actually showcases our unique personalities, and to take some pride in the way that we show up in the world. That doesn't mean that it needs to be the whole of our personality, but we do need to teach our inner children to show up in the world in a way that sends the message to other people, hey, I respect myself. I treat myself well because I think I'm deserving of that. Fourth way I recommend working with the inner child, inner parent dynamic is to improve your relationship with self-regulation. So again, a lot of the time I see inner child work being approached from the angle of go fly a kite or eat a popsicle or do something that a 7-year-old would like. But you know what else 7-year-olds like that they're never going to tell you in their own words, but that they deeply intrinsically need in order to feel safe in the world? They need discipline. They need to know that there's a responsible adult watching out for them who will take care of their needs, which sometimes means telling them that they can't do things they want to do. So a question I find useful to ask myself to work with my inner child, inner parent dynamic is when I am feeling fussy, impulsive, out of control in some way, what might a child need in those circumstances? What might help kind of settle their nervous system and get them back to a place of regulation? And very often, the answer is that I need more structure. A big part of emotional regulation is being able to kind of relax into that which is predictable in our lives. So if we are just following every feeling as it comes up, we're actually denying ourselves the opportunity to feel calm and relaxed on the whole, because we're just kind of elusively chasing some sort of positive feeling. But when we know that no matter what, there are things I'm going to do for myself that I might not love in the moment, but that will bring me closer to the kind of life I want to have and the kind of consistent emotional regulation that I need, then the times when we're feeling kind of fussy or emotionally bad don't feel as scary, because we know that we've created a life for ourselves where to some degree we're able to regulate our own emotional experiences. So those deeper feelings are safer for us to access in the first place. Once again, sometimes what we need is more play and more joy and more excitement, but other times what we need is more discipline and self-trust. And it's our inner parent's job to assess when it's time for what. Feeling kind of dead inside, maybe time to let the inner child out to play more. But if you're feeling kind of emotionally out of control, that might be the time for the inner parent to step in and give you more structure and discipline in your life, so that your inner child has the predictability they need in their lives in order to feel safe and relax. And the last way I recommend you start working with your inner child, which is kind of the direct inverse of what we just talked about, is to improve your connection to your life force energy. So the part of yourself that is enthusiastic, that is curious, that wants to understand and interact with the world in a dynamic, ever-changing way, all of that energy comes out of your inner child. So if you're feeling creatively drained, if you're feeling burnt out, if you're feeling overwhelmed, very often those are signs that your inner child hasn't been prioritized enough, that you haven't been giving them enough time and space and permission to be playful and curious and unencumbered by adult responsibilities. So again, we're always going to be trying to find that balance between figuring out which parts of our lives do need to be controlled and kind of tightly monitored in order to give ourselves enough safety, and how spontaneous and curious and adventurous we're allowing ourselves to be, because those are the traits that end up pushing our lives forward. But at the end of the day, all of this is about striking a balance between those two things. Just like parents and children need to work together in order to figure out what is going to help the child grow up in a healthy way, The more rational and the more impulsive or emotional parts of us also need to work together to figure out how to stay both engaged with our lives and excited about them, and responsible and capable of taking care of ourselves. So what this turns into is a dialogue between these parts of ourselves that never ends. One week our inner parent might really need to take the reins, and then the next week it might be time for our inner child to come out and play some more. This is going to fluctuate constantly based on the conditions of our lives and what's important for us at any given point in time. But in kind of plain language, all this is about is balancing our short-term and our long-term wants and needs. The inner parent is looking out for us in the long term, the inner child is telling us what's going to make us feel vital and engaged and invested in our lives in the short term. And both of those parts of ourselves are incredibly important to listen to and to take seriously. Sometimes taking our inner child seriously means allowing ourselves to not take things so seriously for a period of time, because very often that in and of itself is the precise medicine we need. All right, I'm gonna leave it at that for today. As always, let me know in the comments what you guys are thinking, feeling, what's coming up for you as you go through this. I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other and your inner children, and I will see you back here again soon.